The holy place, the most holy place, and the foyer of the temple were all paneled with wood, as were the frames of the recessed windows. The inner walls of the temple were paneled with wood above and below the windows. The space above the door leading into the most holy place was also paneled. All the walls were decorated with carvings of cherubim, each with 2 faces, and there was a palm tree carving between each of the cherubim. One face, that of a man, looked toward the palm tree on one side. The other face, that of a young lion, looked toward the palm tree on the other side. The figures were carved all along the inside of the temple, from the floor to the top of the walls, including the outer wall of the holy place.
The interior decoration of the temple is fraught with significance. Wood is used extensively in the interior, a precious commodity in itself by this time, since 1/3 of the trees on Earth were burned up during World War III. More to the point, wood, unlike stone or glass, is a living thing. Its use is a reminder of the life Yahweh has provided. The windows mentioned earlier admit light to the interior, for Yahweh is the God of truth and light, and the carved decorations, dual-faced cherubim, speak of the 2 natures of Yahshua the King, his humanity and his sovereign deity.
There were square columns at the entrance to the holy place, and the ones at the entrance of the most holy place were similar. There was an altar made of wood, 3.5 feet square, and 5.25 feet high. Its corners, base, and sides were all made of wood. This, the man told me, is the table that stands in Yahweh's presence.
This is a scaled-up version of the altar of incense that was placed in the holy place in the tabernacle.
Both the holy place and the most holy place had double doorways, each with 2 swinging doors. The doors leading into the holy place were decorated with carved cherubim and palm trees, just as on the walls. And there was a wooden canopy over the front of the temple's foyer. On both sides of the foyer there were recessed windows decorated with carved palm trees. Ezekiel 41 NLT.
As doors go, these are huge. If you'll recall, the entrance to the holy place was 17 feet 6 inches across, and that of the most holy place 10 feet 6 inches. I think we can safely assume that doors that wide will be somewhat taller than your standard American 6 foot 8 inches. They could easily be several stories high. We're getting some insight into why the walls need to be as thick as they're described.
Then the man led me out of the temple courtyard by way of the north gateway. We entered the outer courtyard and came to a group of rooms against the north wall of the inner courtyard. This group of structures, whose entrance opened toward the north, was 175 feet long and 87.5 feet wide. One block of rooms overlooked the 35-foot width of the inner courtyard. Another block of rooms looked out onto the pavement of the outer courtyard. The 2 blocks were built 3 levels high and stood across from each other. Between the 2 blocks of rooms ran a walkway 17.5 feet wide. It extended the entire 175 feet of the complex, and all the doors faced toward the north.
That is, away from the temple itself.
Each of the 2 upper levels of rooms was narrower than the one beneath it, because the upper levels had to allow space for the walkways in front of them. Since there were 3 levels and they did not have supporting columns as in the courtyards, each of the upper levels was set back from the level beneath it. There was an outer wall that separated the rooms from the outer courtyard. It was 87.5 feet long. This wall added length to the outer block of rooms, which extended for only 87.5 feet, while the inner block, the rooms toward the temple, extended for 175 feet. There was an entrance from the outer courtyard to these rooms from the east. Ezekiel 42, 1-9 NLT.
This terraced 3-story building on the north side of the temple was mirrored by one on the south side, spoken of in verses 10 through 12. In fact, the whole temple complex is perfectly symmetrical, its center line running through the east-west axis of the temple.
Then the man told me, these rooms that overlook the temple from the north and south are holy. It is there that the priests who offer sacrifices to Yahweh will eat the most holy offerings, and they will use these rooms to store the grain offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings, because these rooms are holy.
Now you know what happens to the meat roasted in the sacrificial offerings, as well as the grain and other offerings that are brought. They are for the use and sustenance of the priests on duty. It is one of God's ways of allowing His people to participate in His provision.
When the priests leave the holy place, they must not go directly to the outer courtyard. They must first take off the clothes they wore while ministering, because these clothes are holy. They must put on other clothes before entering the parts of the building complex open to the public.
The whole temple service is designed to symbolize the holiness of Yahweh, His separateness from His creation. The garments the priests wear are symbolic of imputed righteousness, without which they may not and cannot minister before God. But the priests cannot pass this righteousness to others. Each worshiper must receive God's gift for himself.
When the man had finished taking these measurements, he led me out through the east gateway to measure the entire temple area. He measured the east side. It was 875 feet long. He also measured north side and got the same measurement. The south side was the same length, and so was the west side. So the area was 875 feet on each side, with a wall all around it to separate the holy places from the common. Ezekiel 42:13 through 20 NLT.
In case you've lost track, the 875-foot width breaks down as follows. 87 feet 6 inches for the length of the northern gate, plus 175 feet clear area, plus 87 feet 6 inches for the inner gate, plus 87 feet 6 inches to the center line of the temple, 175 feet for the whole inner courtyard, that is. Then repeat all of that to get to the outside of the southern gate. And, if you're wondering, yes, all of this will fit on the Temple Mount. Barely. Its shortest dimension, the southern edge, measures 910 feet. But as we shall soon learn, this magnificent, perfectly square edifice won't end up being squeezed onto the herky-jerky quasi-trapezoid that is the Temple Mount, and not just because of all the anything-but-holy cultural and religious baggage that's associated with it. The millennial Jerusalem will be barely recognizable, a far, far cry from the present city, right down to a radically altered topography. In fact, there seems to be a translation glitch that the New Living Translation scholars have taken it upon themselves to correct without so much as a margin note. The actual Hebrew they've translated 875 feet, that is 500 cubits, is chamesh mea kane, 500 reeds, in verses 17, 18, 19, and 20, a dimension that, if we're using the definition of reed or rod from Ezekiel 40, verse 5, comes out to almost a mile. But in verse 16, the first time the number is used, the text reads, chamesh hamachane. Is amma another word for 100? No, it literally means mother of measure, and it's the usual word translated cubit, that is, the length of the forearm. But as Strong's notes, the word when substituted for meah means 100 cubits. Therefore, it would appear that in these verses, a reed does not take the technical definition of 6 cubits, but merely means a unit of measure. Hence, the NLT translators are perfectly justified in their conclusion. The measurements listed in verses 16 to 18 mean 500 long cubits, or about 875 feet. We interrupt this architectural treatise to bring you an important announcement, a very important announcement.
After this, the man brought me back around to the east gateway. Suddenly the glory of the God of Israel appeared from the east. The sound of his coming was like the roar of rushing waters, and the whole landscape shone with his glory. This vision was just like the others I had seen, first by the Kibar River, and then when he came to destroy Jerusalem. And I fell down before him with my face in the dust, and the glory of Yahweh came into the temple through the east gateway. Ezekiel 43, 1-4, NLT.
No man alive would have been better equipped to appreciate the significance of this vision than Ezekiel. This very man had witnessed God's glory depart in a similar vision some years before. Some highlights from his account.
The cloud filled the inner court. Then the glory of Yahweh went up from the cherub and paused over the threshold of the temple, and the house was filled with the cloud, and the court was full of the brightness of Yahweh's glory.
This is part of the familiar wheel within a wheel vision. Though it's a fascinating study, I'm not going to explore all the rich imagery here, but merely cut to the chase.
Then the glory of Yahweh departed from the threshold of the temple and stood over the cherubim. And the cherubim lifted their wings and mounted up from the earth in my sight. When they went out, the wheels were beside them, and they stood at the door of the east gate of Yahweh's house, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. Ezekiel 10, 3, 4, 18, and 19.
The glory of Yahweh departed from the temple in stages, leaving via the eastern gate. Then, after another of Scripture's ubiquitous prophecies about the future restoration of Israel, Ezekiel reports,
So the cherubim lifted up their wings, with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel was high above them. And the glory of Yahweh went up from the midst of the city, and stood on the mountain which is on the east side of the city. Ezekiel 11, 22 and 23.
Which mountain is that? It's the Mount of Olives, just across the Kidron Valley from the Temple Mount, the very spot from which the risen Yahshua, who is the glory of Yahweh in human form, ascended to heaven after instructing his disciples, the very spot to which he will return on the Day of Atonement. Ezekiel, in his earlier vision, had seen the Shekinah, the glory of God, depart from the temple. Now he sees it returning, as before, via the eastern gate.
Then the Spirit took me up, and brought me into the inner courtyard, and the glory of Yahweh filled the temple. And I heard someone speaking to me from within the temple. The man who had been measuring was still standing beside me.
God himself now addresses the prophet.
And Yahweh said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne, and the place where I will rest my feet.
Not to be picky, but the Shekinah doesn't have feet. Yahweh is referring to his manifestation as the Son of Man. King Yahshua will enter the temple courtyard through the eastern gate, and it will be closed behind him.
I will remain here forever, living among the people of Israel. They and their kings will not defile my holy name any longer by their adulterous worship of other gods, or by raising monuments in honor of their dead kings. They put their idol altars right next to mine, with only a wall between them and me. They defiled my holy name by such wickedness, so I consumed them in my anger. Now let them put away their idols, and the sacred pillars erected to honor their kings, and I will live among them forever.
Yahweh is putting his money where his mouth is, so to speak. He's declaring that when he comes in his glory to the temple Ezekiel has been describing in such great detail, he will never again depart, ever. That is, as long as mortal man walks the earth. For Israel will have repented by then, permanently and completely. The chief priest who had Yahshua crucified in 33 A.D. had been given an important clue, one they ignored. Yahshua could not have come to reign on the earth at that time, because the temple he entered didn't match Ezekiel's excruciatingly detailed vision. Yet Daniel's prophecy, that of 9 verses 25 through 26, had pinpointed that very moment as the time Messiah would come. The only possible conclusion was that there would be two advents fulfilling two bodies of seemingly contradictory prophecy.